My guest this week is Jenna Littler. Jenna is an independent advisor to leading businesses in the luxury retail, fashion and beauty sectors, having established her own practice in 2021. Prior to that, she was a senior vice president at Burberry, where she spent 12 years in a variety of commercial, marketing and strategy roles, including leading the third-party business globally and serving as chief of staff. At the end of her tenure, Jenna was one of the most senior female leaders in the business. Before joining Burberry, she worked at McKinsey and Company, and prior to that, she participated in the UK government's Fast Stream programme as a civil servant. But she originally began her career in financial communications. So she's had a real variety of professional roles and is perfectly placed to talk to us today. She graduated in History of Art from the University of Cambridge and remains a passionate supporter of the arts, including through her role as trustee of Art Academy London. And in 2021, she was elected a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, where her teaching focuses on the topic of corporate reputation. She's an active mentor to emerging talent in the fashion and luxury industries. And to boot, she's a really lovely person. It was a great fun interview. We had a great time making it, and I really hope you enjoy it as much as we did. I'm Bob Judson. You're listening to Leading for Life Stories. And without further ado, let's get on with it. Well, Jenna, welcome. Fantastic to have you on the podcast. I'm really delighted you're able to join me. You've got a really interesting background that I'm really looking forward to hearing more about. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Bob. I'm thrilled to join you.
It's an absolute pleasure. So just as a starter for 10, really, could you give our listeners a short summary of your career journey to date?
Okay. So I always find this quite difficult to do succinctly. So I will attempt to do so, partly because my career journey, my professional journey is pretty non-linear, particularly in its early stages. I studied history of art at university, left university with little idea of what I wanted to do with my life. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the choices that I made at that stage. I ended up going into the city. I worked for a financial communications consultancy for about 4 years. I left there. I trained as an interior designer for a year, which is something I don't often talk about, but I did take a year in my mid-20s and trained as an interior designer. I joined the Fast Stream, the government's Fast Stream, UK government's Fast Stream program. So I was on that for a couple of years and then worked briefly as a civil servant, in a policy team in government. And from there, I joined McKinsey and spent a few very happy years there and then moved from McKinsey to Burberry. And I would say that's probably the pivotal moment in my professional journey was moving into luxury fashion. And I spent 12 years at Burberry. And about 2 years ago now, I left Burberry and I set up my own independent advisory business. I advise clients in the luxury fashion and retail and beauty industries on strategy and go-to-market strategies for commercial businesses. So I am about, I would say, midway, I hope, through my professional career, and I'm exploring plural life at the moment. So I have my own business. I teach. I sit on a non-profit board. I'm about to join another, fingers crossed. And so doing a variety of things professionally now.
Yeah, doing a ton of things, that's for sure. I didn't know about the interior design bit. That's fascinating.
You've seen my house, so you might have something to say about that.
No, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Now I have seen your house, yeah. But when you go right back to the beginning, though, particularly the relatively diverse start that you had there in terms of what you studied and then what you did, and then ultimately ending up in through the Fast Stream into McKinsey, I'm just curious to explore a little bit about what motivated you and how you kind of prepared yourself really for the start of what then turned into a much fuller career when you moved through McKinsey and into Burberry.
Not brilliantly is the honest answer to the question of how I prepared myself. I think with hindsight, I was very focused, perhaps because I was quite an academic child, on the things that I would be good at. I wasn't a kid who naturally took many risks because I was afraid of not succeeding at things. And I think as a result, I learned quite early the things I was good at, and I became hardwired to go after those things where I thought I would be successful. And I think this is something very relevant to my journey and some of the pivots that I've had to make along the way. And it's something I observe, actually, I see a lot in women, in young women. The first question is what will I be good at, as opposed to what will make me happy. And so I went through my academic training very much with that mindset. And I think where that took me to on graduation, having studied a subject that didn't qualify me to do anything obviously immediately, certainly anything that would make me any money. It was much more about what should I do, as opposed to, who am I and where do I want to take my life? And again, looking back, I think therefore the choices that I made early in my career were much more dictated by the what might be the things that I can do, as opposed to what might I do that would kind of feed my soul and develop me as a human being. It was more about I left university and thought, I'm not qualified to do anything. I was surrounded by people who particularly were going into law, who'd graduated with degrees in law, or people who were graduating with degrees in medicine. And it was very clear where they would go. And I felt a bit like I'm not qualified to do anything. And so I went to a headhunter and said, what should I do? And I tend to think that people graduating now and coming into the workforce now, they face a whole other set of challenges. So I'm not saying for a moment it's easier, but I think that there is a much more broad-minded approach to thinking about what a career could look like when you're a young person today versus when I was a young person. I graduated in 99, and it was quite a restricted set of choices. If you were graduating with a good degree from a good university, you were expected to go in a relatively small number of directions. And that might be consulting or banking or one of the professions. And so I ended up in the city doing financial communications because somebody, a headhunter, told me I should. And it looked like a way to earn some money. It looked interesting, and interest has always been a guiding principle. But it didn't come from within me. It came from outside me. And I think that I was fortunate to end up in a really interesting business. I joined a relatively young financial communications consultancy called Finsbury, which is now part of, it was bought by WPP. It's changed hands back and forth since. But it was a newish industry at that time, financial comms, corporate communications. I think I was the 18th person to join, and 2 years later we were 100 or something. So super fast growth, a very interesting range of clients. It was agency work, so it was very varied. But I ended up there by accident. I didn't end up there by design. And I think I was lucky, and luck is something that I don't believe luck plays that much of a role, particularly as one's career develops. But I do think in that early stage of my career, I was lucky that I ended up in a place that suited me quite well, surrounded by interesting people and opportunities. That it wasn't because I had sought that industry out. It was almost the opposite.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I see a lot of people when I do workshops and things these days who we talk about this, whether it's good to do the job because it's good for you or whether it's actually going to make you happy. And I've always been pretty quick to stress to people that I think I've sort of measured particularly my military life, but also subsequent to the military by two things. And the most important of those was enjoying what I did. And that is just so pivotal to actually do that. I'm also amused actually that a headhunter gave you advice that as to where to go. I think most of someone said to me when I was leaving the Air Force, headhunters find people for jobs, not jobs for people. Just remember that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that was also the case. Like I said, I think there was a lot of luck that it was a happy marriage.
Yeah.
Because, at that age as well, I was 21, you're kind of professional cannon fodder, aren't you? They don't care. They're not earning very much money from you. It's not really something that I think that they give much thought to.
No, I think that's very fair.
So I do think I was lucky. And as I said, that's not something I will say often in this conversation. But at that point, I think that had a lot to do with it. And then, I was good at it. And maybe that was to my advantage, maybe not. I stuck with it longer than I expected to. I was there for 4 years and I found it interesting. I definitely didn't love it, but I found it interesting enough. And I got a buzz from being good at it. And back to this idea of being hardwired to succeed. And I guess also to please, that was an environment that played to those elements of my personality that had yet to be developed by experience. I didn't have any experience other than an academic experience. And my academic experience taught me that you should work hard and do well. And if you work hard and do well at the things you are asked to do, then everything will be okay. And so I think it was a natural first choice for me. A lot happened thereafter that changed the way that I operated and the way that I think today. But that was the starting point.
Yeah, I wrote recently about forks in the road in your career. And I think the thing for me that's most important is when you've decided which fork you're going down, because inevitably you meet forks in the road, then don't regret which way you went. You've got to then look forward and carry on. Don't look back and wish, I wish I'd gone down the other fork, because there's no point. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you've just got to carry on. And interesting on the luck point, when I interviewed General David Petraeus for the podcast,
I was listening to that.
Oh, good.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Well, he said, I thought he was fascinating on luck, because he said, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And I think that's such a good statement, because it's so true. It really is so true. McKinsey to Burberry interests me. I mean, they are completely different, other than potentially one being a client of the other. What prompted that move? How did that come about?
So I'd been about 2 years at McKinsey, I guess. I was really happy. Because I was in a best-in-class organization, surrounded by smart people. It was well organized. If you worked hard, that was recognized. There was kind of a clear progression pathway. And so it fit all those dimensions of my personality that I was describing before, around being in an environment where hard work is and outperformance is recognized and rewarded, and also having the stimulation of being in the flow of an organization that is full of really bright people asking and answering big questions. And I loved that. So I was really happy. And at the risk of sounding like I just do everything at the behest of headhunters, I had a call from a headhunter. And this time I was more prepared. So that headhunter actually called me about not a completely different job, not a job at Burberry. And I said, I've been thinking about whether I would ever move from here. And at that point at McKinsey, I was doing a sort of hybrid role. I was looking after communications in the UK, and I was also working on knowledge projects. So publishing, looking at topics like women in leadership, the UK economy, London as a financial centre, these kinds of thought pieces. And I said, there's only one thing that would tempt me out, and that's a director level role. So at that point, that's what I was targeting, which was the next step up from where I was, in a listed business in the FTSE 100. And it would need to be a creative business. And really, there's only one. There was only really one truly creative business in the FTSE 100 at that time, and it was Burberry. And I'll come back to why I stipulated creative business in a moment. And I said, call me back if that comes up. Director of comms at Burberry, right? I thought nothing more of it. And 6 months later, the same headhunter calls me back and he said, you're never going to believe it. It's come up. And up to that point in my career, and I think I was 30, just turned 30 at that point, I had bounced around going where there appeared to be interesting things to look at and do. I moved quite a bit, compared certainly to my peer group, all of whom were progressing in a linear fashion through their chosen careers. I was bouncing around, and I tended to go where I just thought, that looks interesting. I might try that. This one I wanted this really badly. And the reason I wanted it so badly was not because it ticked the box of the right level and the right profile of company. So, a big, serious listed business, a reasonably senior position. It was this point about working in a creative business. And the thing that I came to realize about myself through a combination of maturing and gaining experience was that however much a role might fit me in terms of my being good at it and my being intellectually capable of being successful at it, the thing that was missing for me was my heart was not engaged. And the difference, and this came to pass at Burberry, but the thing I identified was missing was what I had had in my academic life previously at university was a complete freedom to spend my time thinking about, talking about, inhabiting a subject that was chosen purely for love, right? I didn't choose to study history of art because I thought at all, as I said, about what might happen afterwards. I chose it because I loved it. And it fed something in me that I kind of point to my heart when I say this. It fed something in me that I knew was missing in my professional life. And I had spent time thinking about what that might be. And I am not a maker, right? I am not a creative in the classic sense. I am a creative thinker for sure. And I love to be surrounded by makers, by creative people. And I love to be surrounded by beautiful things. And that got me thinking about, is there a way to put to work the experience that I have and the expertise that I've developed in an environment that gives me those things that I think are missing in my professional life right now? And I just put my finger on this one business and I'm like, they make beautiful things. They appear to be a business that's at a really interesting moment of its development, a brand that was, frankly, very broken, that was being revitalized by an American woman and a British guy who seemed like very good people. And all of those things felt very attractive to me. And I felt that they would answer a need that I had in making a decision about my future that would be beneficial to me. And so that's how I identify Burberry as, let's call it like a target. You asked what the transition was like. It was very, very hard. I had in my mind that it would be this wonderful, natural fit for me because I was an art historian trapped in corporate life. The reality is I was moving from an environment, a set of environments that were really governed by logic, by empirical evidence, by data. They felt very ordered. And I stepped into what felt like chaos. And I spent 12 years in this chaos. So I now understand it's not chaos. It's just a different way of working where you are in an environment that's governed by different things. It's an environment that's governed by creativity, by instinct, by ideas, by paced by creative perspectives. And none of those things is any more or less legitimate than the factors that had governed the organizations I'd worked in previously. But it's fundamentally different. And if you come from a place where you've come through an education system and then you've come through a professional experience that's governed by one set of things, and you move into one that's profoundly different, that's terrifying. For me, it was terrifying. I felt that I didn't know which way was up. It's like when you ski and it's a whiteout and you just think, I don't know what to do for the best, because I can't see the piece ahead of me. I don't know what's happening around me. All the training and all the expertise I have is suddenly not valid in this environment. And it really pulled the rug out from underneath my feet. And they are all the things that I came to love about that company, about that industry, and about working with creative people. But at first, it was hugely disorientating. And it also threatened to undermine my confidence in myself and my abilities. It was a huge shift.
Yeah, I can imagine. And actually, this is such a great segue to my next question, because within Burberry, as you said, you were there for 12 years and you had a range of roles with increasing seniority as you moved through the company. My perspective, and I accept this might be completely wrong, is that the fashion industry requires a pretty nuanced leadership style, certainly compared to the world I've spent most of my life in. If that's the case, how did you adapt your leadership style as your career progressed through Burberry?
It's a great question. And I think that it was a mixture of embracing parts of my natural self, my natural style, that I had perhaps set to one side because I felt that they were not advantageous leadership attributes in my previous roles. I'll come back to that. And learning from others who were successful in this creative environment in which I found myself, and trying to understand what it was about them that made them successful. And I think to go back to the first of those, which was what is it about me that I had felt was not a valid style of leadership in the earlier stages of my career. And that is something around the role of kindness in leading people. And I had gone through systems where you would never use that word when describing effective leadership, because it might infer softness. It might infer an inability to make tough decisions. And therefore, it would never have been in my 20s something I would have said about my style. I was tough, right? I was a tough person to work for. And I would say I am still a tough person to work for, but for different reasons and with a different tone. And I think I learned to be myself as a leader in Burberry. And I learned to embrace this part of my personality, or my leadership style, which is all about investing in people and creating the conditions for others to do their best work. And as a leader, I think that is an act of kindness. It is an act of love. And we talked a lot about things like love and kindness at Burberry as leadership strengths. And they can sit very, 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 very comfortably with driving a successful team. They can sit comfortably with being demanding. They can sit comfortably with setting audacious goals. they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that was a big realization for me at Burberry, that part of my personality, that leadership trait that I have. And I think a lot of people that I've worked with would say this. They would say, you know, she's tough, but she's fair, or she's demanding, but she's kind. And it's something that I'm very proud of, to be able to combine those two elements. And I think Burberry, as a creative business, allowed me the opportunity to be that kind of leader. And that is an authentic version of me, as opposed to me putting on a costume and saying I'm something else, and owning that part of my personality and owning that element of my leadership style, I think is something that has enabled me to be successful, certainly within Burberry. I had a great deal of success quite quickly in Burberry, and I'm not sure that I would have been able to do that in another kind of organization like a McKinsey, because I think to a certain extent I would have been pretending to be something that I am not. And I was given the opportunity within Burberry to be what I am. And I was rewarded for being what I am, as opposed to thinking that I should be something else. And that was a big shift for me.
Yeah, so many great points in there. I think the authentic leadership is obviously something people talk a lot about these days, and it's such an important thing that you are kind of comfortable in your own skin. You develop a style that works for you, and actually, I think the kindness and compassion, empathy, love, all those sorts of words are actually entirely appropriate in leadership, even in much tougher organizations. I mean,
yes.
Look back at the military. Actually, it was really important to be a compassionate leader and understand what your people were going through, particularly when they're going through really tough times, either personally or professionally. And so, no, I totally get that. And it's great that they were the type of organization that really rewarded that, because it can be that it isn't that way.
Absolutely. And I think the second part of my answer to that question was about observing other people who were successful in that environment. And I had the privilege to work for two amazing leaders who were my direct bosses. So the first was a woman called Angela Arendts, who was the chief executive for, let's call it, the first half of my time at Burberry. She was a very, very charismatic American woman, an extraordinary leader of people, extraordinary. I think once in a career type of leader. I have never met anybody like her before or since. That's not to say she's in a class of one in terms of the impact that she's had on my thinking about effective leadership, but she was a charismatic visionary who engendered huge amounts of self-belief in those who worked with her. And that was her superpower. And she was a woman and she had 3 children. I don't have kids, right? But, at that point in time, I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted children or not. And to see a woman who was balancing a career at the highest level with a family life and who had time for everybody, always made you feel like you were the only person in the room, never made you feel like your ideas were stupid, always gave you the confidence and backed you on things that you felt passionately about that were important to you. And her leadership style had a very, very profound impact on what I hope or what I aspire to be as a leader of people. And then Christopher Bailey, who was the chief creative officer, who became the chief executive, and I was his chief of staff for the time he was chief exec, who is a very different personality to Angela, that you used the word compassion. He's the most compassionate leader I have ever worked with. And he taught me that that's not just okay, that can also be a leadership superpower. And it struck me, observing what happens within Burberry versus my previous experience and looking at my contemporaries and others I know who work in other industries. Yes, I'm sure that is changing, but I still think that the creative industries are naturally geared towards some of those types of leadership behaviors at their best, versus other, let's call them more structured, more traditional industries. By the way, that the flip side of that, when you look at a creative business, when it flips into negative behaviors, there's a whole host of things that I don't think deserve congratulation. And so I'm not saying they're perfect, but I'm saying at their best, I think they do those things. They focus on the human aspects of leadership and the role of compassion and kindness and reinforcement in a way that is unusual in corporate life.
Fascinating. Just on that negative point that you were bringing out a minute ago, just unpack that a little bit for me. What sort of things did you see that were, because it's interesting, you have seen, I mean, McKinsey, as you say, pinnacle of the professional services world, by their own admission, speaking as a former Deloitte guy, but
through gritted teeth.
Through gritted teeth, absolutely. But a very, very renowned firm and clearly, a very, very, very successful firm. To move to Burberry, which is a completely different type of industry, you've obviously seen, and you're quite unusual in that, both those different, very different styles. So just on the, you've talked a lot about the positives. What are some of those negatives? What did you see that was perhaps less attractive?
So I think maybe just to contextualize this a little bit, when I think about the difference between working for a Burberry versus a McKinsey, I think about the spectrum of personalities that you have in a creative business like Burberry versus most other organizations, where you tend to have people who they might have they will have different perspectives on things, but you can generally have a lot of people who are reasonably alike. In a creative business, you have this very broad spectrum. In a creative business, that's also a commercial business, by the way, right? So you're a publicly listed company. You need all that big company functional governance architecture to enable that company to function. But you also need this really stretched out, let's call it right brain, left brain. You need it super stretched into the creative dimensions of doing business that is unusual in other businesses. So you have lots and lots of people in that business who think completely differently. And I always characterize it as you've got two languages being spoken in a company like Burberry. You've got the language of creativity and you've got the language of business. And some people can kind of operate on the threshold of those two worlds. And that makes you useful because you speak both languages. And some people are very, very far on one or the other end of the spectrum. And particularly those who are far on the creative end of the spectrum, sometimes for others in the business, it is difficult to understand why they are behaving in the way that they are behaving. And I think I'm somebody who is definitely happy at the interface between these two worlds, because I get a kick out of working with creative people because it feeds something in me. And I am therefore probably accepting of some of the behaviors that are perhaps required, certainly routine within the creative sphere. Things like acting on instinct, not on evidence. You don't blaze a trail with things. You don't come up with great creative ideas by obeying the rules. They largely happen when you break rules. And the traditional company structures aren't set up to encourage rule breaking. They're set up to do exactly the opposite. They are set up as guardrails to encourage people to do things the way that they should be doing them. So when you have somebody or people on one side of this spectrum who are changing their mind constantly, they are asking for investment for things that don't make any sense on paper, they are moving the goalposts at the 11th hour because they've had a better idea or a different idea. If you see that as disruptive behavior that you need to iron out, you shouldn't be working in a business like that. You have to see that as necessary, even, necessary, desirable. And you've got to be somebody who is able to reconcile those two sides of the equation in order to get something out at the end of it that makes sense. And that is very different.
That does make complete sense. I can see, it's not perhaps quite as extreme, or in some ways it is quite extreme, I suppose, when you look at my military world, where often you've got lots of people, particularly in the Air Force and the flying side of the Air Force, where, the egos are plenty, extroverts are plenty. I mean, that's everybody in the game. But at the same time, you then dealt with intelligence analysts, for example, who are often quite introverted, very, very clever people, very specific in the way they would go into things, slower to think things through, wanted to ponder everything before they reached a decision. And meeting in those minds and meeting in the middle somewhere was a real challenge, and definitely a question of adapting your own style when you became, as I certainly did, become more of a senior leader in that space, to recognize how you harness the talents of those people,
yes,
rather than just put them off. It was a really, really important thing. Absolutely.
I think harnessing their talents, and also, which I agree entirely with, and maybe we'll come on to that in a bit when we talk about specific lessons around successes and challenges along the way. But as well as harnessing people's talents, I think there is something really powerful about creating a culture where you make everybody feel that the contribution that they are making to the end product is not just necessary, it's vital. And whether you are a lawyer or you work in the finance team, or you work on reception, or you work in the design team, or you work in the marketing team, in a creatively led business, which is what Burberry was and remains, the temptation is or the risk is that you create a rock star culture where anybody who has anything to do with the quote unquote creative dimensions of the business is a class A citizen and everybody else is a class B citizen. And I think what we did as a leadership team at Burberry was we flipped that model, which is the received wisdom within luxury fashion. And we found ways to make everybody feel involved in the creative life of the business. An example of that was we began to do something during my time where when Christopher was the chief creative officer and Angela was still the chief executive, we began to live stream the shows. It feels like an eternity ago. Prior to 2010-ish, runway shows were still closed door. You'd see photographs, but you wouldn't be able to watch them online. And we were right at the start of this move towards what some people call the democratization of luxury fashion. I'm not sure that's the right word, but certainly the opening up of elements of luxury fashion to a wider audience. We realized that was, yes, an opportunity to bring external people into the brand and its creative life. But perhaps even more importantly, it was a way in which we could bring our teams in, and not by just giving them the access that everybody else had, but by giving them access before the outside world saw the runway collection. So Christopher would do live streams on the day to teams. He would talk them through the collections. He would invite them behind the scenes. And that was for everybody. We invited a much broader subset of people within the organization to come and experience the shows. We had offsites that were all team offsites as opposed to specific function offsites. We were constantly looking for ways to bring all elements of the organization into its fundamental purpose. So there wasn't this idea of us and them, the creative people and the not creative people. We're a creatively led organization that depends on everybody in this company being on the bus. And your job as a leader is to ensure that everybody feels like they are participating as opposed to just looking from the outside in. And that ironing out of the us and them culture was a definitional to Burberry in that time, both internally and externally. We saw no tension between being exclusive as a brand and being inclusive in our approach. And I think that held true externally in terms of how we thought about the brand, how people experience the brand in the outside world. But it was certainly true internally in respect of how we led our teams through a period of what was extraordinary growth and required very hard work. And it was a wild ride. And the way in which we kept people engaged with that wild ride was by making them feel excited and involved, and that they were participating in it, that they weren't just observing it. And all of that, I think, was very important for me as I developed as a leader.
It's just, again, great examples. I talk quite regularly about the John F. Kennedy NASA story, when they were trying to put a man on the moon, and him going visiting Cape Canaveral as it was, and chatting to a guy that was just sweeping the floor, and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, basically, Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon."
Yeah.
Because they had that genuine one team culture,
yes,
which I think is so important, and particularly, I was having this conversation relatively recently with a client of mine where we were talking about the support structure underneath what was the sort of outward client facing element of the business. And I said, how often when you're having some kind of celebratory account event for a big win or a big end of delivery or something, do you actually include the people from HR, from IT, from security? And of course, the answer is virtually never, which is a really, I think it's a lesson that is so valuable. And you brought that out brilliantly. It's really helpful because it's such an important facet. If you genuinely want the culture in the company to be, everyone is part of the mission, and it's all about delivery of the mission, whatever the mission happens to be. And that's analogous to pretty much every type of organization. They've all got a focus. They're doing something that is specific to that.
Yeah, and what is your North Star? I think that's the important question. Is, I talk about Burberry being creatively led, and we would always say this, that the creative parts of the business are in the driving seat, right? They're driving the bus. So we have to be led by that. We have to understand that the choices that we make are choices that are first and foremost informed by the brand, the health of the brand, and therefore the creative choices that we make about the stewardship of the brand. So, if that's if the mission that we all align behind has creativity at its heart and at its core, then we can all understand what we do to contribute to the achievement of that. And it isn't that the creative people are more important than the rest of the people. It's that the mission is, the vision is dictated by a series of creative choices about brand stewardship. And that's fine. They're not, in other organizations, they might be financial choices. They would be data driven. They would be somehow more empirically led. In Burberry and in other similar businesses, those things are not in charge. Different things are in charge. It doesn't mean then that any one person is more or less important in the achievement of that goal, but how you define that goal, the inputs, the relative weighting you give to the different inputs, that's the thing that's different.
No, totally agree with that. That's super analogy. But whilst we're on that kind of topic, leadership traits, we've touched on some of this in what you've already said, but which are the things you think are most important, both for you that you really value, but also actually for people that follow you, and also some of the role models you've mentioned and people that you've been looking up to in leadership? What do you think the most important facets are?
Well, I'd reiterate kindness as the first one. And I think that when I use the word kindness, I use it to express a way of thinking about organizations as groups of human beings. And I see no difference in the way that you conduct a relationship with a human in your work, in your life outside work versus your life in work. What is a company other than a group of humans, right? What is an organization other than a group of humans? You take the humans away, there is nothing left. So why would you behave differently? Why would you fundamentally change the way in which you treat other human beings in the workplace versus in the rest of your life? And I'm somebody who believes that you should treat people with respect and kindness. And therefore, I believe that in my work life as well as in my personal life. And so that I take that into my leadership style. The first thing that I would highlight. The second thing is I guess integrity. I think it's impossible to understate the importance of trust in effective management of any situation, certainly in my commercial experience, and particularly as you become more senior. It is impossible to do everything yourself. It is impossible to control the quality of everything directly. I spent a lot of time in my early career trying to do that, and it exhausted me. It made me less effective in the workplace. It made me certainly more challenging to be around outside the workplace. And you have to learn how to allow other people to do things, and trust sits at the heart of that. And I think for me, that is really linked to integrity. You can't expect other people to be their authentic selves if you are not. And people will see through it immediately if you're not. And so I think that link to integrity, authenticity, and the ability to trust one's colleagues to do the right thing, even if the right thing doesn't end up in the perfect results, you lead from the front in showing people the importance of doing the right thing. And I think the other thing I would highlight, and this is probably more of a McKinsey learning, which is honesty. So one of the things that you learn very early on at McKinsey is this idea of speaking truth to power. And if you disagree with something, it's not just that you can say it, but you must say it. And it's not about being difficult. It comes back to it's about being honest. And I think creating an environment where I've always striven to do this, where my teams feel able to tell me what they think about things, not because it means they're always going to get their way, but we're able to have an honest conversation and everybody feels that they're able to express an opinion or a concern or an idea. That's where the best results come from. If people don't feel able to do that, whilst knowing that it doesn't, as I say, mean that they're necessarily going to get their way on things, they're not going to, the leadership imperative remains with the leader, right? That's part of your job as a leader, is to make those calls. But creating an environment where people feel able to be honest is something that I think is important and healthy and actually improves outcomes.
Oh, totally. And the sort of just culture angle where I used to talk about umbrellas. So I worked with the teams that I looked after. I'd put an umbrella up over them all the time, as long as they were honest to me and they told me, and I found out before somebody told me from above me that something had gone wrong. So if they made a genuine mistake, I would protect them and I'd look after them to the nth degree on that. But at the same time, obviously, that umbrella could turn upside down and turn into a funnel if I needed to turn around and say to someone, you really did not do this right.
Yes.
Because you can't forgive everything in the organization, and you certainly can't forgive people who are dishonest, deliberately break the rules, or don't inform you when they know they should have done, or go way outside their remit. And I think your examples there are terrific. I mean, trust is another one where it's a two-way street. If you trust people, they recognize you trust them. They tend to be more effective as a result of that, and they actually work better knowing that you've trusted them to do it, so they feel it's on them to make sure they deliver a better job. If you're micromanaging them, so often actually they'll be less careful about the way they do their job because they know you're probably going to check it anyway. And it's a really interesting win-win, really, if you get it right, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's something about how you spend your time. I feel that the more seniority that I've had as I've developed over the course of my professional career, the more time I've chosen to give to people management. And I'm somebody who historically, I guess, has been more task focused. It's like, we need to do this and we need to do it brilliantly. And I've had to work on myself to move away from being task focused and perfection focused towards enabling others to do good work. And you can't enable others to do good work unless, first of all, you give them the conditions in which to do it. And that part of that is about making sure that you clearly articulate the right, a good strategy, that you have a roadmap to get there, etc. But most of it, in my experience, is investing the time in the people that you are asking to deliver that and ensuring that they are adequately supported to do their best work and to approach opportunities and challenges as best they can. And that doesn't mean that they will be successful. It doesn't mean also that they're always going to try their hardest. But your job as a leader is to enable them to give them the opportunity to do their best work. And that is very different than earlier in one's career, controlling outcomes. It becomes all about setting things up and orchestrating the activities of others. And sometimes that means that what pops out at the end, you look at it and you think, well, it would have been better if I'd just done it myself. But that's not good leadership.
Yeah, and you have to let people make some mistakes. And I think looking in the mirror and remembering what was it like when I was at that stage and how did I operate, and is really important. Talking of which, looking back across your career so far, and I appreciate you've only done half of it. So what would you be saying to a school-age Jenna based on the experience you've got so far if you were providing her with some advice now?
I think there's something about having the the confidence early in one's career to think widely about opportunity. And this is personal to me, but I think it's also something that I've observed is common to certainly to a lot of women of my generation, that there wasn't always the confidence early in one's career to push boundaries, whether they're your own boundaries or whether they're boundaries that are imposed upon you. I think the imposition of boundaries is less of an issue today than it was when I began my career 25 years ago. But there is something about feeling safe early in one's career to experiment. And my 20s, when I look back on them, you can construct a narrative that says, because I moved around a lot, I was very experimental. I wasn't particularly experimental because I always chose things that I felt that I would be successful at. And I didn't choose things that were more challenging, had a greater risk of failure, but might have opened up different kinds of opportunities. And I don't say that with any regret. I think it's something I'm very mindful of at this point in my career, where I'm taking a moment midway through to try plural life. It would have been, very honestly, much easier to stay in the flow of opportunity in the organization that I left than it was to take a step outside and say, maybe there's a different way of working. Maybe there's something else out there. Maybe through experimenting, I will learn something, identify something about myself and my future that is going to inform a different way of professional life. I wouldn't get that opportunity if I just kept doing the things that I was good at. And so thinking less about what you're good at and more about what you care about, what makes you happy, what gives you fulfillment, even when that carries risk, is something that I would encourage my younger self to do, because I'm doing it now. And I think it would have been an interesting way to approach the early stage of my career differently if I had my time again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what your perspective is. I see a lot of the very young generation, the Gen Z, as it were, who are definitely doing that. I mean, I think they are looking at their value set is different. They're looking at the way they'll only work for people if actually the company they're going to work for actually meets their values. They're looking at migrating from one career to another quite quickly and experimenting, to use that word, with variety of different things. So they definitely seem to be changing, don't they, in that approach?
Yes. And if anything, Bob, I think the pendulum swings in the other direction, of course, doesn't it? And hopefully settles somewhere in the middle. If I were there today, I'd probably complain about the tyranny of choice. Just as I said earlier, I felt that options were pretty restricted. I think today, maybe it's too far in the other direction. Maybe there is too much choice. There's certainly an entirely different degree of pressure that exists, I think, on young people today around what possibility looks like and what achievement looks like in a world where anything is possible, because everything is now shared, and therefore what you compare yourself to 25 years ago, I compared myself to my peer group, and there were moments where that felt fine and there were moments where it didn't feel fine at all. And you think, well, gosh, that person is doing X, Y, and Z. Why am I not? Today, you're comparing yourself with the rest of the world, and you are comparing yourself with fake versions of people's lives. And the pressure that must put on young people is immense. And so I think there is definitely that. But that said, there is also an entirely different way of thinking about how one might approach making a living and being a productive person in the world. And that isn't about, there are 4 professions that you can go into. It's like you can be a farmer, or you can set up an organic food business, or you can, turn a walled garden into a retail and hospitality destination. You can plant wine. You can do any of these things. And I think that's better understood by young people today, although, taken to its extreme, it maybe isn't always positive, but I think that's definitely a shift.
I think it's very fair. I think it's challenging for managers, though, for their leadership that's in the middle at the moment of the structure. Certainly, based on my experience, that they're finding that pretty difficult to navigate. Mm-hmm. And it is a constant theme that I hear in workshops, etc., where people are going, these guys, we just don't get what they do. They do, they don't want to turn up to work in the office at all. They want to finish at 4:30 because they've got other stuff to do. They'll prioritize stuff in their personal life over their work life when we would never have done that. And that doesn't mean they're not necessarily effective in terms of delivery. Some of them are actually very effective in terms of delivery, but they have a very different style. And I think that is quite a challenge for quite a lot of younger leaders.
Absolutely. And for young leaders, but also, people leading young teams. And I've spent a lot of time, particularly in fashion, there's a lot of young people, particularly young women, working in fashion. And it's one of the oddities of luxury fashion in particular, that in the younger parts of the organization, it's all women. And in the senior parts of the organization, it's all men. And I don't think it's just explained by having children. I think that there are other things going on there, but there's a flip that happens. But, you do have an awful lot of young women. And even when I was leading big teams at Burberry that were female and young, I was already starting to see some of these changes live. And I'm reminded, listening to you talk about some of the challenges of one generation leading a new generation that has different motivations and a different perspective on the world and different experience and in how they have grown up, and how you do that effectively. I can't remember who once said this to me, but and it's probably well known, but there's a definition of leadership which is about asking the right questions as opposed to having the answers. And this is something that has really resonated with me as I've developed as a leader. I'm hardwired to be somebody who feels like you should be providing the answers. If you're in the driving seat, you should have the answers to the questions. And actually realizing that being a good leader is asking the right questions, or I think that is one element of good leadership, is knowing the right questions to ask. I think when you are leading a team of people that has a different set of experiences, and that could be because of their age, it could be for a whole host of different reasons, where they're located, what experiences they've had. Taking the time to ask questions of people is a great investment in productivity, in team cohesion, ultimately in results. Is back to organizations and teams just being groups of people. Instead of thinking, how can I get done what I need to get done? Taking the time to ask the questions of the people with whom you work. Why do they want certain things? What are they hoping to achieve? Some people would say, well, that's pandering to the individual. I think it's to the benefit of the team, because then you can make smart strategies to get the best out of your people, not by giving them what they want, but by understanding what motivates them.
Totally agree. And I think actually beyond just asking the right questions, it's also recognizing, and particularly across generations, that you are not necessarily the smartest person in the room.
Rarely the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a real tendency, I think, particularly with, it's a classic, isn't it? White older male type thing where they can be a bit dominant, a bit authoritarian and a bit pushy about stuff, where they'll look at somebody who looks and probably is 20 years younger than them and go, well, I know more than you because of my experience. That may not necessarily be the case. And I think recognizing that and leveraging it's back to what we were talking about earlier on. It's getting to the best outcome you can get to and asking questions intelligently as a leader. And I talk about this quite a lot. I've talked on the podcast previously as well about you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and use them in that order and in proportion. I mean, I think is quite important.
Yes.
Because if you speak first as a leader, particularly in an environment where people look at you as a relatively strong figure, they will tend to go, well, they're not going to gainsay what you've said. So they'll just roll with that, and you'll suppress often good debate. So asking questions is really great. It's really hugely important.
Exactly. And I think there is something about keeping an eye on that. If you are in one organization and your leadership journey is relatively accelerated, as mine was in Burberry, I moved pretty quickly up through the ranks in Burberry. This aspect of being mindful of the message that you are sending through your behavior, your language, how you present yourself to the organization, whilst remaining true to yourself and being your authentic self, is something you need to keep an eye on. If you go from being, as I did, a director to an SVP in 5 years, you're working with largely the same groups of people. And there's a leadership challenge inherent in that you suddenly find yourself senior to, in some cases, very senior to people who were your peers. And you find yourself a peer to people who are very senior to you. And the way in which you conduct yourself along the way and the messages that you send through your behaviors become so potent. And being aware of the message that you're sending, always checking yourself, not because there should be some element of artifice to how you present yourself to the organization, but being mindful of that relationship between you and the other people in the organization, and what your behaviors say about where you sit and how you can be most successful, how you can add most value, what the kind of rules of the game are in terms of your relationships with other people. That is hard work. And it's something that's easy to lose sight of when you're working in a very high pressure, fast moving environment and you just need to get things done. The impact of your behavior on other people can be profound, to your point around what people observe if you speak first rather than listen because you're in a hurry to get something done. What others take away from those types of behaviors can echo in a way that can be unhelpful if you lose sight of how important that is. And it doesn't mean you're always going to be perfect at it and you're always going to be checking yourself and thinking, am I sending the right message? Am I doing the right things? But being mindful of that. And in some cases, being honest when you failed at that. And that's something I've definitely done. And I've more so as I've moved through my career, is when I feel that I haven't handled something in the way that I should have, I will have an honest conversation with my team about that. Because back to this point about authenticity and integrity and trust, unless you're role modeling those behaviors, you can't expect other people to respond in kind. And therefore, if it's clear that you might have handled something differently or better, I think it's better to have that conversation. And it doesn't make you appear weak. It's the opposite of that in my view, is if you can admit to your mistakes, if you can own the parts of your personality and your style that are not your greatest strengths. That makes you human. And when you're human, you become a more powerful leader of other humans because they can identify with you. It doesn't mean that in my view, it doesn't mean that they will respect you less. I think they respect you more.
That's such good points. Really, really good points. I think the feedback loops, having the right feedback loops as a leader are really important so that you've got people who you trust, who will tell you, who are genuinely going to give you some 360 feedback in a constructive, useful way, rather than it being at some kind of end of year appraisal, which is, kind of, I wish you'd told me that 6 months ago, I could have done something about it. That I remember vividly when I was in a couple of my command roles, that I was so conscious of being self-aware enough to know that if I'd been in a really difficult situation 1 minute in a closed room somewhere dealing with something that would be particularly challenging, that then walking out and walking down a corridor through a corridor full of people who that might be the first time they'd seen me as the kind of the pinnacle of the organization that day, it may be the first time they'd seen me ever or that month, that even my facial expressions and my body language really mattered. Because you could, they would remember that. Your echoes comment is absolutely right. I think that you can suddenly find that you've given someone an impression of you that is not really you.
Yeah.
But it was just because in that particular moment they caught you on a bad day, and you can't have too many bad days as a senior leader in an organization publicly with your people. You need to be, as kind of representative of what you want to be and setting the standard you want to set as best you can.
Yeah, and Bob, I think this is. Really, you say this so well, and I think it's so important because the importance of standards and values in leadership as opposed to outcomes is something that has been a shift for me personally in my journey. And I still remember a great boss that I once had saying to me in sort of the dying hours of a project that was going badly wrong, that I had invested a lot of time and energy in, saying to me, I think it's important that you fail at this. And I was like, what on earth do you mean we have to get this over the line? And I was killing myself and killing my team. And he said, I think it's important that they see you fail. And you should think about how you manage that with them. Because I put too much emphasis and set too much store on success being the metric by which you measure how well you're doing as a team. And there are so many other metrics that are at least as important, one might argue more important, in terms of how you're doing as a team. And that was a big learning for me. As it happens, the project, it came good. It came good, right? So I did it. It wasn't a failure, but my goodness, there have been failures since that time. But I still remember that sort of, I would say, late 20s, being told that by my boss and just thinking, wow, you're right, because people don't want to follow other people because they're always successful. They want to follow other people because they believe in them. And belief is driven by many, many other things than thinking you might always win. Certainly in the sectors and the organizations where I'm interested to be, that isn't the only driver of followership. And that was a big learning for me.
I totally agree. I mean, when you're in a bad position, you need to think about, is that position going to get worse by continuing to pursue it? Or actually, is it better to retreat and come back and fight another day in a different way and in a different direction? Because I think that's such an important thing. And you do learn so much from things that have gone wrong, as long as, and interestingly, it's a point I'm going to bring out in another podcast, you talk about debriefing and you learn from it. And I think actually that's something that a lot of corporates, in my experience, don't do enough of. It's something we were religious about in the military, that every sortie you flew, literally every sortie we flew, you'd debrief it. It didn't matter what it was. You would have a formal brief, and you'd then fly, and then you'd come back and you'd have a formal debrief. Everyone there, no excuses and no rank. Nothing. It was a completely gloves off expectation that if you had done something that was a learning point. Bear in mind, most of the time, most of my career I was flying single seat airplanes, so you can cover up a lot. You can't cover up everything, but you cover up a lot if you're on your own in the cockpit. But the point was, can we actually get better? How do we get better? And we get better by debriefing it well, constructively, and positively identifying the lessons that we can take from that, and then implementing those in a structured, appropriate, useful way,
yes.
And then go and do the same thing again. And I've seen too many corporates not do that, where they'll do something, they complete it, box it up, done, fine, move on to the next thing. And actually there's no time, and there's a constant pressure on time. Time's money. It's overhead to be turning around and doing too much of this introspective navel gazing, and they don't like it. Whereas actually that definitely is a strength in my view, if you've got the ability to do it.
And if you've got the ability, but also if you've invested the time in creating a team dynamic where that is not just a nice to have, it is a requirement within your team that you have those conversations, ideally in a structured way, as you say, and that is part of running any good team and being successful in any project, is to be very clear on what you're trying to achieve, ensure that everybody understands what contribution they need to make, and constantly monitoring how you're doing and pivoting where necessary versus your plan. All of that basic hygiene around how do you operate any business in pursuit of a goal that you've identified. The differential then in the quality of the outcomes, I think, is directly linked to the culture that you're building within your team and the ability that the team has to trust one another, to feedback, to challenge, to accept when the point has come, all to pull in the same direction, regardless of whether you believe in that direction or not. All of those things, they're very human. They're very human. And if you don't role model the right behaviors, if you don't invest the time, you will not get from a team what a team is capable of. And that doesn't mean that you always will get the best outcome, but it should mean that most people are trying their hardest, and you will identify the people who are not. And those people who are not, you are then able to have a conversation about whether that you can course correct that or not, and then you act accordingly. But it all comes back to this, for me, this overinvestment in the human beings around you and ensuring that you're speaking the same language and that you are able to have the right kinds of conversations. Because the quality of your strategy, the design of your operating model are worth nothing in an environment where you don't do those things, because they're all reliant on the people who are delivering them. If the people who are delivering them don't speak the same language, can't stand each other, are confused or depressed or unable to speak their minds, frightened, fearful, whatever, what's the point?
Yeah. And or don't understand the task, which is another really key thing, I think. Making sure that as a leader you are clear about what you're actually expecting, what the limitations are around it, that they can operate within, because that's, again, an often too common a trait. Hey, I want to switch tack a little bit. You mentioned the failure word a minute ago, but before we get to failures, let's talk about good things. What's the most important achievement in your career so far for you? And it's probably a bit too early to talk about legacies, but what are you hoping to go on and achieve?
Big question. So the biggest achievement, if I may, I have two. One's personal and one's more.
You can have two.
One's inward looking, one's outward looking. So the outward looking one is something that I had not paid sufficient attention to when I was at Burberry, that came into very clear focus to me when I made the decision to leave and it was announced that I was leaving, was the impact that I had had in my time on other women in the organization. And I'm not a big one, and I've never made a big song and dance about being a woman in the workplace, because there's a lot I think we need to be very careful of when we begin to talk about positive discrimination, when we talk about quotas, etc., which I really don't believe in. I think that we need to pay more attention to creating level playing fields. But once the playing field is level or thereabouts, everything should be about merit. And it doesn't matter whether you are where you come from or the color of your skin or whether you are a he, she, or a they. None of that should be relevant. And we've work still to do on leveling the playing field, but I think it's getting better. It takes time. And so I've never been somebody who's been particularly vociferous about women's lot in the workplace. I also recognize that as somebody who hasn't had children, very much by choice, my path has been relatively smoother in that regard than many other women and many of my contemporaries. And so I absolutely acknowledge that. And as a result, I think I had not paid sufficient attention to the impact of my journey through that company on younger women who were in the organization, had just joined the organization, and looked at what I had achieved there and felt emboldened by that. And that's a responsibility in and of itself. And we go back to the conversation that I had about who I learned from. I looked at Angela, and I was never the chief executive of that organization, but by the time I left, I was in the top 3 women in the organization. And I had messages from women in the organization who I had never even met when it was announced that I was leaving. And I was very affected by those. And a little bit, I checked myself a little bit because I felt like I hadn't paid enough attention to that aspect of my journey. I'd paid a lot of attention to people and to teams, but I hadn't thought enough, I think, about the impact that I was having and can have on other women. And that has become a focus for me more in the past couple of years. I'm a pretty active mentor to a lot of young women, largely in luxury fashion, but also in other areas, because there is still work to do. And I feel a responsibility to other women to give what help I can to them as they go through their professional career, building it, the choices that they are making along the way. I think I have something to add for other women. And so I perhaps wasn't conscious of it at the time, but I'm quite proud of that, even if I didn't set out to be a sort of pioneer for other women in the organization. I'm proud that I was able to offer some inspiration, I guess, to other women along the way.
No, so you should be. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, just before because I know you're going to come back to another highlight, but I mean, there's a lot made, you've alluded to it, about glass ceilings still there, discrimination, bad behavior in the workplace. And I've clearly seen that a lot. Over 40 years in work in an Air Force, obviously, where some of the stuff was terrible. We had, for example, for women, there were loads of roles that weren't even open to women for a long time in the time I was in the Air Force. It's got a lot better in my perspective, but I'd be really interested in your view about what your perspective is now on it. What do you think, how much more do you think there is to do? What are the real worry points still for you?
So I think in the course of my career to date, 25 years, it's changed profoundly profoundly already, right? And that is fantastic. And I think we should all be glad that opportunity is becoming more evenly distributed. Let's put it that way. What I think we need to be careful of is that we don't make the mistake of forcing things too quickly that end up creating situations where women may get put into positions that they're not ready for or they're not best qualified to do. And if things then don't go well, it's the old cliff point that, often a woman is brought into a situation because, a woman is required or the optics will be right. And that situation actually, that woman is not being set up for success. And then the failure is associated with a woman having done something that resulted in failure. And the reality is that male or female, nobody was going to succeed in that role, or that person was just too inexperienced, or they didn't have the right kind of experience. It doesn't matter whether they're a man or a woman, but a woman gets picked to do it. And if she fails, then that ostensibly positive action of putting a woman into a position of responsibility becomes counterproductive. So I think we need to be very careful. And that's why I get nervous about quotas and I get nervous about positive discrimination, that actually you end up doing something weirdly unsisterly as a result, which is you're not setting women up for success. You can't just, back to leveling the playing field, it's not helpful to just take half the players off and replace them with different players and then expect them to be successful. That's not how it works. It's a process. And I think if we try and force it too much, then we end up creating more problems for women, not solving more problems for women. I'm a big believer that talent is entirely evenly distributed and opportunity isn't, right? So the focus should be on more evenly distributing the opportunity. And I'm thrilled that the world is making progress in that regard. There is a long way to go, but we should proceed with a degree of caution and a focus on the long term, not the near term. However seductive a focus on the near term might be.
Totally agree. I think it's a good so far, more to do.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
100%.
So you asked about the second thing, and I think this is a learning about myself and my personal style, which is that in the early stages of my career, I was extremely hard on myself about getting to the right result in whatever situation I was put into. And as I gained in experience and seniority and was in charge of bigger teams and larger remits, that became more and more challenging. And I think that the freedom that has come with learning to trust others to deliver and the understanding of the responsibility that I have to set other people up for success rather than having a direct responsibility for the quality of an outcome, that has enabled me to be a better leader. It's enabled me to be a better wife, a better daughter, a nicer person, a better friend, because I am not easier on myself, but I am more respectful of the fact that as a leader, you are still a member of a team. You are not somehow separate from it. You sit. I always think that as a leader, you sit at the center of a team, not at the top of it. And that has been a big shift for me as I've gone through my career so far. And as I said, that's made me, I think, happier and more effective. So that would be my other lens.
No, I love that. I think the center of the team thing, that's so true. That's brilliant. What about the low point then?
Low point. because I'm somebody who puts a lot of emphasis on relationships within teams and more broadly, I have found the toughest moments of my leadership journey, the moments where I've had to let people go. And I've had quite a few of these because I've been involved directly and indirectly in restructuring activity, including on a number of occasions within my direct team, and sometimes with people with whom I've worked for a long time. And that's when the investment that one makes in developing a relationship with co-workers, I think, really comes to the fore. And people who take a different perspective than I do about how you should handle relationships in the workplace might say, well, that's when the rubber hits the road, because if you're too close to people and you're too friendly with people, then that makes it harder. My experience is nothing's going to make it easy. But actually, if you have taken the time to demonstrate to somebody that you have their best interests at heart, that you have a high degree of personal integrity, that you are focused always on doing within reason or within your capabilities the right thing, then hearing that message from somebody who you believe to be a decent person is, I hope, a better way of hearing a message that is never, or very, very rarely going to be well received, but is unfortunately a necessary part of corporate life. That in order to do what's best for the business, sometimes you have to do something that is very tough for an individual or individuals. And I find that extremely hard. But I will say that the only thing that makes it any easier is the hope that I have been able to demonstrate to that person that I will have always thought about these situations deeply, and I will have challenged myself to do the right thing. And therefore, they can trust in the decision that has been made, even if it is a difficult one. But yeah, letting people go is horrible. Always. I don't think it gets any easier.
No, I don't think it does. I think you're right. You can't make it easier. But one of the things that interests me, I've had a few occasions when I've had pretty tough conversations with people, which have been career ending for them in the military, in terms of assessments. And obviously it's a job where you don't fire people, but you certainly their career can stop. And I've had one or two of those where actually it's been a relief to the individual. They've been, for too long, they've been being told things that they kind of knew in their heart of hearts weren't right. And they knew they probably weren't right for the role, and they needed to do something else. And it is interesting because, I mean, that's not always the case, of course. I mean, clearly some of those are much more difficult conversations, but it's interesting sometimes how it can come, as you say, if it's coming from someone in a genuinely thought through way, and they have the right kind of impression of you as an individual in terms of you having their best interests at heart and you being an appropriately kind and compassionate leader, then they get it. And so it's not always as bad for them as it might be, I think.
100%.
Just the last couple of things, because I'm very conscious that you've spent time in a very busy professional services firm. You've also spent time near the top of a very busy and high-powered fashion luxury goods firm. Work-life balance, finding ways to de-stress and relax. What are your top tips?
So, work-life balance. I'm somebody who gives a lot to my work, and because I choose to. And this is part of how I'd answer this question, which is, if you find something that you enjoy, it doesn't mean that every day is going to be a walk in the park, right? There are always going to be days when you wake up and you think, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this anymore, or I can't, or not today. But by and large, if you enjoy what you do, and if you, as I do, think part of your responsibility when you come to lead teams is to create an environment where people are at least having some fun, right? They are enjoying being around each other, even if there are uncomfortable moments along the way. Then that distinction between kind of work and life becomes a softer one. I think it's interesting that we talk about this idea of a work-life balance in a world where we're constantly connected and where those boundaries are kind of bleeding into each other. I don't for a moment suggest that we should be working all the time, but the fact is that there is less of a distinction between work and life than there used to be when people went into offices and then left at a certain time and went home and didn't have mobile phones and whatever. So it seems to me almost like a false construct to say that we need to find a balance between the two. I think more relevant is how do you ensure that you make the most of wherever you are at a particular moment. And if you find that when you're working, you are constantly stressed and angry, change something, because work doesn't have to feel that way. It will sometimes, but it shouldn't always. So I think there is a danger in thinking that if you do some stuff outside work that makes you happy and less stressed. I think the other thing that I would highlight in terms of maintaining balance, whether it's between work and life or just more generally in one's life, the temptation to always eat last, right? This idea of leaders eating last. I think taken to extremes in life, that's not healthy. And like many people I know, I have had periods of professional life where I've neglected myself at the expense of my work. And by the way, it's made me less effective at work by attempting to be more effective and give more of my time to work. I've ended up being less effective at my work. And I've also gone through moments in my personal life through my career, as again, everybody does, that have been quite profound in terms of the impact that they've had on me, whether that, I lost my dad 10 years ago. And that was a big wake up call for me in terms of how I was treating myself in respect of the investment that I was making in my work. And so I am now very committed to ensuring that I get enough sleep, I exercise, I eat well, I take seriously my responsibility to myself to allow myself the time to do those things, because it makes me better at everything else I do. And I used to think those things were necessary sacrifices. And now I recognize that they are critical investments in being a sort of healthy and productive human being.
Yeah, so true. And particularly that recognition in yourself. I think that when you know it's time to do something different, to change, to take some time off, whatever, because if you haven't got that level of self-awareness, then that's a real challenge sometimes in leadership roles. You just carry on, burn, and eventually burn out, which is
and everybody else is suffering along the way and you don't. And the problem is you lose your perspective, and without perspective, you're nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your very well stated point, it makes you less efficient, not more efficient. You think you're doing the system a favor and you a favor and everything else. It's not, it's the opposite. Hey, switching tack to something else. I tend, when I've got people who've led in senior roles in different industries, it seems churlish not to ask them a bit about the industry more generally and the world we're in and where that's going. And you've had and still got, because of what you do now, a fantastic view across the luxury goods and fashion world. Just interested in your perspective on what the most important changes have been, and perhaps more importantly in some ways, where you see it going over the next 10 to 15 years.
I think probably the answer to both is sort of all roads lead to the same place. I think inevitably when thinking about luxury fashion, the biggest change of the past 10, 15 years has been the impact of digital on the way in which luxury brands present themselves to the world, the way in which they market themselves, the way in which they sell their products. This is often confused with the idea that somehow luxury fashion has been democratized. I take issue with this because I think it's sloppy language and sloppy thinking. There in no way has there been a democratization of luxury fashion. Luxury goods are more expensive than they have ever been. The barriers to entry are higher in terms of the price of the goods than ever. There's no way in which people are more actively participating in creative processes, etc., not in a meaningful way. But what they have done is, or what digital has done is, it has created a much wider network of influence for luxury brands with audiences that they couldn't previously reach because of geography or because of, financial means. It has massively broadened the audience for those brands, which, by the way, is all good for the brand. So, that's, you look at the performance of most luxury stocks over the past 10 years, and that will tell you everything you need to know, with a few bumps along the way. It's been great for the business. So I think that kind of takes you to what happens now. I think two big factors for the future that I would highlight. The first is the whole sustainability agenda. It's particularly, I think, meaningful and challenging in fashion, because the fashion industry has not been entirely honest with itself or the world about the impact that it has on the planet. I think both directly in terms of producing and selling goods, but indirectly through fueling a desire for the new all the time. And I think the way in which human beings are changing the way that they think about consumption more generally is going to have a profound effect on how luxury and fashion brands more broadly behave going forward. And I don't think they've figured that out yet, what that's going to mean. There's lots of experiments happening. But clearly the relationship between more mindful consumption, using less, buying less, and the commercial health of brands that exist to sell more things every season, that is a difficult thing to reconcile. So I'll be interested to see how that one develops. I wish I had the answers. I have some thoughts, but maybe that's for a different podcast. But that is definitely one. And the other one is convergence, I would say. I think for those who know the industry, we pay a lot of attention to what Bernardo says, the guy who runs LVMH. And he really is the grandfather of the industry, and he is a very smart guy, and that's evidenced by the success of the business that he's built. And he now talks about LVMH as being in the business of culture, so not in the business of fine wines and spirits or fashion or accessories or whatever it is. And this really resonates with me in a world where the kind of the necessary things that we need to get done in our lives are increasingly happening online. The things that happen offline, how we spend our time as human beings in the world, eating, drinking, traveling, buying things, the experiences that we have, these worlds are coming together. Art, fashion, music, hospitality, they're all ultimately a choice that we make about where we invest our time as humans. And so those worlds are coming together. The blurring of the lines between retail and dining and music and art, these are less and less discrete sectors, and they're converging into something new and different. And we're at the start of that, and I'm interested to see how that develops. But there is definitely a convergence that's happening, and fashion and luxury are right at the heart of that. So I'm glad it's happening in the physical world, because I'm a big believer that the offline world absolutely has a place and a value, and we maybe need to reappraise what the value of what happens offline is. And I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks ever so much. No, it'd be really interesting, as you say. There's lots happening there. Hey, almost the last question, but what's the most memorable event of your career so far?
It's a huge question. How would I answer this?
You're only allowed one this time, by the way.
I'm allowed one this time. I'm going to give you something that actually happened as opposed to a thought about something I've learned. So if I think about a memorable event in my career, the thing that always comes to mind is runway shows. So if you choose to work in luxury fashion, the highlight of your year are the shows. And if they're not,
I've seen The Devil Wears Prada. So,
yeah. if it's not the highlight of your year, then you're probably working in the wrong business. And when I was looking after communications at Burberry, we were doing a lot of work with sort of emerging tech and social media companies on the West Coast. And it was a sort of unlikely friendship between this storied British 160-year-old brand and the likes of Facebook then and Apple. We did a lot of work with on the technology side. We did a partnership with Apple where we'd started live streaming the shows, as I mentioned before, and we'd be doing that for some years. And we were challenging ourselves to think, how could we do this differently? And they had a new iPhone coming out. And so we cooked up a plan to, instead of using cameras to film the show, it was the first iPhone that was really about the camera. And we were like, right, let's film it on iPhones. So rather than have cameras, let's show the capabilities of the new iPhone camera by live streaming the show from the iPhone before it's released. And so they came over from the West Coast with the iPhones, and each iPhone had its own security guard. And we had to try to orchestrate not just a show, but a show filmed on these iPhones. And each iPhone was so securely guarded. And it was all highly experimental. And there was a very, very, very strong risk that it was all going to go horribly wrong. And it didn't. And it was wild. And it was groundbreaking. And being a part of something that went right to the heart of why you work in an industry like this, which is to create beautiful moments and do innovative, creative things with other innovative, creative businesses. And there's a moment where the lights are down and then they go up and the first model walks down the runway and there's always a little tear in your eye. And that one was very special for me for those reasons.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow. Amazing. I'm just loving the concept of each iPhone having its own security guard. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it doesn't get much more Devil Wears Prada than that.
Yeah, definitely not. Definitely not. Finally, though, Jenna, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
This is the most difficult question I've ever been asked. I don't know how to answer this question. It's too difficult. Can I answer it in a slightly oblique way?
You can.
Okay, so the most difficult question I've had to ask myself, and that was the decision I had to make around leaving Burberry. So I think when you have a definitional period, and maybe you know this feeling within your professional life where you've been really happy and lots of things, in my case, were pointing in the right direction professionally. And my head said stay and my heart said go. And people have asked me this question before in terms of, what's the hardest decision you've had to make? And I said, it could be perceived as taking the easy road, right? Because you're stepping out. And actually, it was the toughest thing I've ever had to do, which was to be honest with myself about the degree to which my work was still right for me after a very long period of success and investment and the opportunity to continue to be successful. But I think it goes back to this point about that we touched on earlier, which is just because you're good at something doesn't mean that it's necessarily the thing you should be spending your time on. And I found myself inadvertently in my comfort zone. And although I was in a very challenging and senior role that was very rewarding, I realized that in order to move forward, I needed to step out. And that was very emotional for me. And it was a very, very tough question I had to ask myself. And I'm confident I've made the right decision, not least because I think once you've made a decision, it's the right decision, because you can't go back and remake it. But if I can answer it slightly obliquely, that's the answer.
No, that's a great answer, and and I can completely see that and understand exactly where you're coming from. I've as you alluded to, I faced a similar sort of thing myself, where I was running out of road in the Air Force. I could have stayed, but it was the right decision to go, and I don't regret it at all. So no, it was a good move. But Jenna, you've been fantastically generous with your time. It has been so illuminating.
It's been a joy. Thank you.
Oh no, absolute pleasure. The pleasure is mine. That's really great. Thank you very, very much indeed, and really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity, Bob.